Greetings, family. Welcome back to the Learning Channel on YouTube. It's been a while, but I had some important information to talk to you about as we process where we are in this day in life and time. This presentation here, we'll be talking about deciphering a real-life psychological thriller. So we're talking about real-life events, but we got to look at history that has presented us and put us into a situation today to decipher what is really going on. I want to talk about a couple of books, and one of the first books I'm going to talk about is written by Robert J. Lifton, Nazi Doctors, Medical Killing and the Psychology of Genocide. I wanted to pick up on one particular chapter called the Auschwitz Self. Psychological themes in doubling. Now, I'm trying to break this down because I'm trying to explain to you what has happened with post-pandemic. What has happened with us as a people and how we're being manipulated and controlled. Now, when I say Auschwitz is in Poland. Poland, this area was occupied by the Nazis in Germany, and they were using this site because it was easy for it to be like a junction site, railways for prisoners and the people who are involved in this process to kind of go through Europe. So Auschwitz was a location there in Poland. And you think about Germany, Germany had a location there in Europe, but Auschwitz itself was in Poland. This was where you had the greatest atrocities of people being annihilated. So we're speaking of these areas right here. It's interesting. I'm a tennis player, and you got all these different countries over here, and most of these tennis players who are dominating tennis today are from this area of the world. It has nothing to do with this psychological thriller component here. What we're talking about here is breaking down why this past history relates to current history. I wanted to read some passages from the Nazi Doctor to explain why I'm saying that we've been hoodwinked and bamboozled. But the ISIS Papers by Frances Cress Welsing. When she got her degree, her parents asked her, "What do you want for a graduation present?" She said, "I want to go to Nazi Germany because I want to study the mindset of a people who want to wipe out another people." So we're talking about evil. And if you break down that word evil and you spell it backwards, you get live. Some people don't think about life and living. They think about evil and destruction. Well, she wrote ISIS Papers, The Keys of the Colors, to break down the reality of this European mindset to want to destroy and kill off other people, this whole Nordic Aryan mentality, which still exists today. But when we talk about those people during that time period, we can't act like they don't exist anymore. We can't act like they've been removed from our reality. So in this chapter 20 of the Nazi Doctors, the Auschwitz Self. So speaking of self, meaning that the people living in that environment were caught up living in that place of destruction, and they were following along with guidelines, with plans, with protocols, and so they were caught up. So there's a so-called self, a reality that people were stuck in as the occupiers in that area. So there's a psychological component to this, and the doubling relates to the reality of being, when we say a doctor, killer and a healer, or a healer and a killer. So that's the doubling aspect of this. The doctor, if not living in a moral situation where limits are very clear, is very dangerous. That was an Auschwitz survivor. Some passages. Since the healing-killing paradox epitomized the overall function of the Nazi regime, there was some truth in the Nazi image of Auschwitz as the moral equivalent of war. War is the only accepted institution in which there is a parallel healing-killing paradox. Now, when we deal with this COVID-19 pandemic and the pressurized feelings that people were put on to take a experimental jab, not knowing whether that will work or not, and now we fast forward months later, years after, and we see that those who were jabbed still got sick. Some people who got multiple injections still got sick. So that was not the cure for treatment. Your natural defenses are very important. But what we're saying here is that those who were pushing this, were they dealing with healing or were they dealing with killing? That's what we're talking about. Those who are doctors take a Hippocratic oath, and it's so powerful when you think about the Hippocratic oath, because Hippocrates, who's supposed to be the Greek father of medicine, is what they're following. This oath they're taking as what they need to be a doctor. At the end of the oath, it says, all praises due to Asclepius. Asclepius relates to Imhotep, an African there in Kemet, who was supposed to be the first priest, doctor, vizier. He was everything in terms of how we look at the day as a multi-genius. So what we think about the Hippocratic Oath, it all extends from what we know about what happened there in ancient Africa with Imhotep. But that is why the Hippocratic Oath, though a pledge to remain a healer and to disavow killing or harming those one treats, was all but abandoned in Auschwitz. How are you going to be a doctor if you're killing people? The oath was perceived as little more than a distant and muted ritual one had performed at medical school graduation and was readily reversed by the searingly immediate selections ritual, that is, picking who should die, who should not die, as well as by the array of direct pressures and rewards in the direction of a Hippocratic free Auschwitz self. So trying to remove the oath of healing and saying that, well, we're doing this in the interest of this so-called European control and domination mentality. Look at this. In another part of the chapter, it talks about numbing and derealization. I mean, you got to be crazy to want to just go kill people, and then you kill people, then what do you do with the people? That's got to do something to your psyche. So this chapter is talking about what happens. For a doctor, you have omnipotence, like your God, because you're controlling life. You have impotence, because you can't stop the reality that this is not right. So omnipotence and impotence is what Robert J. Lifton talks about in his book. So in this chapter, death control, helpless omnipotence, you had to perform sterilization, as doctors were doing sterilization on these on the Jewish people, as it was simply ordered by the university, which received its order from the state officials and in Auschwitz. So think about the COVID jabs. The government dictated by giving money to these institutions like universities, government agencies, companies, dictated and trickled down to those companies and those universities to say, give these injections to those people. It was dictated from up above. That's no different than what happened in Nazi Germany. The dictations were for control, but it didn't necessarily mean it was going to help you. So you think about the Nazis courted, bullied, flattered, threatened, and above all, coordinated physicians in accordance with their relentless policy. At the same time, they expanded the doctor's identity to that of the militarized medical Führer, Kurt Blome, who became deputy to Leonardo Conti, chief physician of the Reich, captured the spirit of this medical identity in an autobiographical book in which he exuberantly equated medical and military power in their battle for life and death. So we are at war. You were attacked after the pandemic. You were told what you should do. You were taken away from your normal lives. So now we have these doctors. There's a chapter here on the post-war self. Doctors now are trying to, I guess say, I don't know, not that they're wrong, but during the Nazi Germany time, you had those who were involved in it, and they were trying to now restore their prestige. One former Nazi doctor spent decades following conviction at Nuremberg. Remember, they had Nuremberg trials to deal with the reality that these people were doing something wrong. And a long prison sentence, attempting to restore his medical honor during our interviews. This is with Robert J. Liston. He repeatedly asked that I intervene formally and even legally on his behalf, despite my clear declarations from the beginning that no such action on my part was remotely possible. So what I'm trying to say is that when we talk about post-war self, where do you think those doctors went? They just vanished? They went away? No, they went to other countries. Most Nazi doctors who worked in camps fled from approaching Allied armies, but others less identifiable as having been associated with criminal activities told me proudly of collegial encounters, sometimes even joint medical work with Allied physicians soon after the surrender. Whatever the accuracy or exaggeration of these accounts and the possible need of some Allied physicians to see German colleagues as having been less corrupted than was actually the case, what was involved psychologically for Nazi doctors was their intense effort to reconnect with the Hippocratic sphere as a way of claiming they had never left it. Think about those doctors that maybe came to the United States, went somewhere there in Europe, like London, like Europe, like in Paris, like over in other places, still operating with that same mentality to control. Think about the CDC in the United States and some of those doctors that came abroad and came over here to work. Upon returning to their homes, they continued, for the most part, to try to cast off their Auschwitz or Nazi self and to see themselves as essentially decent and moderate post-war German burger physicians of a conservative stamp. An incentive for being interviewed was to meet with me as a doctor to doctor and thereby reinforce their sense of themselves as healers. They were ambivalent, of course, given their residual doubling. Now, that's an important word, doubling. And their sense, accurate enough that I would probe for the Auschwitz or Nazi self. So the doubling was the killer and a healer. You took the Hippocratic oath, but you're killing people, and you're supposed to be healing. So that's a doubling. So, in short, because this one part on discussing, again, the reality of what happened post-war, those people didn't disappear. They went somewhere. I want you to listen to the words of Robert J. Liston before I get to some other books I want to talk to you about. So he's now explaining that this mentality that occurred was extensive. So I want you to hear his words on this program called democracynow.org. I definitely suggest that you watch that program if you have opportunity. This is an 8-year-old presentation here from 2015 that he's discussing the psychologists who aided the torture program when we were going through that Iraq war. Games. So what happened in the past, Nazi Germany? What happened with this psychological organization helping out the military in Iraq? And then now you move fast forward to the pandemic. You see the certain mindset of people controlling things. But let's listen to a few minutes of Robert Lifton's words.
I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. New details have emerged on how the American Psychological Association, the world's largest group of psychologists, aided government-sanctioned torture under President George W. Bush. A group of dissident psychologists have just published a 60-page report alleging the APA secretly coordinated with officials from the CIA, White House, and the Pentagon to change the APA ethics policy to align it with the operational needs of the CIA's torture program. The report also reveals a behavioral science researcher working for President Bush secretly drafted language that the APA inserted into its ethics policy on interrogations.
Much of the report's based on hundreds of newly released internal APA emails from 2003 to 2006 that show top officials were in direct communication with the CIA. In 2004, for example, the APA secretly took part in a meeting with officials from the CIA and other intelligence agencies to discuss ethics and national security. Still with us, Dr. Robert J. Lifton, leading American psychiatrist who has spoken out against the APA's practices. So the American Psychological Association has about 150,000 members, the largest association in the world. That's the APA. The little APA is the American Psychiatric Association, which I assume you're a part of. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, your thoughts on what the APA did?
What the APA did, and I read that report, is what I call a scandal within a scandal. That is, I've been much concerned with the behavior of professionals and their ethics, not just in terms of how they conduct their everyday profession. That's important enough. But their relationship to the world ethically. I became interested in this in working with veterans of the Vietnam War, and in that war, military psychiatrists would be in a position when examining a soldier who was brought to them with anxiety and a sense of outrage at what was going on, would be in the position of helping that soldier to be strong enough to return to duty, which meant daily atrocities. And I asked myself, how did a psychiatrist find himself in that situation? And it had to do with a military structure of medicine and with a psychiatrist entering into what I called an atrocity-producing situation. In my work with Nazi doctors, it was even, of course, much more extreme, probably the most extreme example of any profession, of any country, engaging in extremely immoral behavior, engaging directly in killing, because Nazi physicians were in charge of the killing in Auschwitz, and that's what I studied in that research. But, you know...
What's interesting, both Nermeen and I saw you speak last night on a very different issue, on the Armenian genocide. And you talked about the significance of Dr. Joseph Mengele dying without acknowledging what he did.
Yes, when Mengele, who was a notorious fanatical Nazi, quite unusual in that way among doctors, was found to be dead in a lake in Argentina, survivors of Auschwitz were upset that there wasn't the opportunity to bring him to the dock so that he could confront his crimes. It wasn't so much a desire for revenge as it was for justice. So I mentioned that survivors of Holocaust or genocide, or survivors in general, are what can be called collectors of justice. They need a sense of justice for their own healing. But now here we have American psychologists. There were psychiatrists involved early also in the enhanced interrogation, which spilled over into torture in American use. Fortunately, American Psychiatric Association had slightly more enlightened leadership, and we had the advantage of doctors' Hippocratic oath, which is do no harm, and there could be developed a resolution prohibiting any physician, any psychiatrist from being in the interrogation room. The American Psychological Association took an opposite tendency. It's one thing, and there were a couple of psychologists who were well known who helped create the torture and the whole psychological regimen for the torture crudely and very unscientifically, but with the claim of psychological science. It's still another level when the professional organization supports torture by meeting with the administration and those people who are looking for some legitimation coming from a professional group for torture. And that's what the American Psychological Association did. And that's all too reminiscent of what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung. I'm not saying they're Nazis. We're not Nazis. We're still a sufficiently open society to confront this, criticize it, and do something about it. But with the Nazis, there was this process of Gleichschaltung, meaning reordering or re-gearing all professional organizations, not destroying them, but breaking them down and reconstructing them to serve the Nazi project. That's the kind of thing we must and can confront and avoid here.
Well, last December, psychologist James Mitchell, who was contracted by the CIA while still a member of the American Psychological Association to design its interrogation program, appeared on Fox News to talk about his role in the waterboarding of Abu Zubaydah. He was interviewed by Megyn Kelly.
So were you the one actually conducting the techniques on Abu Zubaydah, or were you in more of a sort of background role?
It depends on when you're talking about. Initially, I was in a background role. Then after he shut down and the enhanced interrogations were approved, I was in an administration role.
Okay, so did you personally waterboard him?
Yes.
We're going to get to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in a minute, but sticking with Abu Zubaydah for now, were all of the methods that were recited in the Senate report employed, like nudity, standing sleep deprivation, the attention grab, the insult slap, were those all used?
The ones you mentioned were used.
The facial grab, the abdominal slap, the kneeling stress position, walling?
Walling was used. The others, if they showed up on the list, they were used. We didn't typically use a lot of those stress positions, and we didn't use any stress positions with Zubaydah because he had an injury.
That was psychologist James Mitchell speaking on Fox News last December. He was the psychologist who was asked by the CIA to design its interrogation program. Could you talk about that, Dr. Lifton, and in particular in the context of what you called earlier an atrocity-producing situation? What enabled this to occur?
Professionals are as prone to being socialized to the norm of a group, including being socialized to evil, as are any other groups in American society. What that means is that psychologists in this case, and there are others from other professions, internalize what is considered to be acceptable and appropriate for them in carrying out their profession. So torture exists. There is the nod from the administration, go ahead with torture, and psychologists then adapt to that, and in this case become not just participants in torture, but the creators of the methods of torture. That's a shocking clip because it shows him kind of slightly reluctantly admitting that they do all those things. Of course, it's denied that they're torture, and that's absurd. They're out-and-out torture. But the fact that they'll come on a network program and describe it as something legitimate is another level of scandal. After all, torture has been conducted, from the time of the beginning of history. It's always been seen, and especially in recent centuries, as something evil. You can judge a society as to whether it engages in torture. You condemn a society that engages in torture. In our case, looking at the sequence, one can praise the Obama administration for ending that torture, but one must criticize the Obama administration for blocking any examination or confrontation of our role in torture. You showed an interesting clip about the city of Chicago. confronting and at least recognizing that the police had engaged in torture of certain suspects. Well, that doesn't undo what they did, but it's a step toward some kind of ethical advance. And for the United States to have engaged in torture on such a widespread dimension, to have legitimated it among professionals like psychologists, for psychologists and others to have created and participated in it, is something that we have to confront as a nation to move ahead in something like an ethical way.
And when you talk about confronting, what exactly do you mean? You've just given a psychological, sociological explanation, understanding, for example, James Mitchell, or Mitchell and Jessen, the company of two psychologists that the Pentagon funneled money into, not to mention other psychologists who didn't even work for them, working at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. But should they be brought up on charges?
Of course they should. There are many situations that I can probe psychologically or psychohistorically, as we say, but have to be approached politically for some kind of resolution. And this is an example of that. A proper confrontation of what we did would mean a real investigation that didn't stop as we got to the top. It's, of course, the order for torture being acceptable and advised comes from above, comes from the highest sources in the administration. That has to be uncovered by an investigation, and there has to be a legal context. Whether or not everybody who participated in torture is in some way condemned and put to jail, I don't know. But at minimum, there must be confrontation and revelation of what was done, who did it, what the consequences were, and how to prevent it in the future.
What do you think of this comment by CIA psychologist, former CIA psychologist Kirk Hubbard, who served as the CIA's chief of operations of the Operational Assessment Division before he joined Mitchell, Jessen Associates? In 2012, Hubbard told the Constitution Project's Task Force on Detainee Treatment, quote, "Detainees are not patients, nor are they being treated by the psychologists. Therefore, the ethical guidelines for clinicians do not apply, in my opinion. Psychologists can play many different roles and should not be forced into a narrow doctor-patient role." Dr. Robert J. Lifton, your response.
What you've heard, what you just recited, is a rationalization for torture and for destructive behavior on the part of professionals. All professions require some sort of ethical code, as I said before, not just in everyday practice, but in what they do in society. And to weasel out of any such ethical requirement because one is dealing not with patients but with prisoners, and of course that administration didn't even give them prisoner rights according to Geneva Conventions. To do that is simply a rationalization for destructive or even evil behavior.
We're talking to Dr. Robert J. Lifton, a leading American psychiatrist, author of many books, including Witness to an Extreme Century, a memoir. We'll be back with him talking about a number of issues, including another of his books, Who Owns Death? Capital Punishment, the American Conscience, and the End of Executions. Prosecutors, judges, jurors, wardens, and the American public in conflict. Stay with us.
So if you get a chance to read any more of Robert J. Lifton's books, I mean, you heard his words. I didn't have to read any more of what he's saying. But we have to look at history. He said the word psychohistorical. You look at Germany's first black Holocaust. Even though the Nazi situation happened there, Auschwitz, Poland, Germany's first black Holocaust, they said, was 1890, 1940, up to 1945. This is Namibia, one of the places that the Germans colonized in the continent of Africa was Namibia. So they colonized these people, and they were committing the same atrocities that they then did to the Jews, but they practiced it first on the black people. And check this out. Let us turn our attention to a particularly disconcerting event in the despicable annals of Nazi Germany horrors, namely the inconceivable experimentation on black World War II soldiers from the United States. The Germans wanted to know how they could best survive in the heat, humidity, and tropical environments of certain parts of Africa, so they experiment on the black people. In order to do all this, the Nazis had to learn how to become acclimated to the stifling, oppressive African sun, so they literally squeezed the life out of black POWs in order to discover the high level of tolerance to the sun that was intrinsic to black skin. We can now add, according to Ferpro Carr, melanin marauders to the list of things the Nazis could be called. But they only needed so many black men for these experiments, so what did they do with the other black troops that were captured? What was their fate? So it talks about the brutality of the murdered African American soldiers. But again, history is a certain mindset of evil. And when you're on the wrong side, you got to make a chance, make a stance. Choose the right side to be on. I'm wearing a France Fanon shirt because France Fanon was an anti-colonialist. Of course, raised in Martinique, trained by the French, fought in the French army, got to be a psychiatrist, was there in Algeria, and noticed that he was on the wrong side of the war. Here as an African in the diaspora, French speaking, he's seeing that the French are the ones that are the problem in terms of their colonization of the Algerian country. So he then switches over and helps out the Algerian Revolution. So there's many books by Fanon that he wrote, that is, Black Skin, White Mask, Dying Colonialism, Toward the African Revolution. The last book was The Wretched of the Earth, but there are many people that have done work on Fanon. So know about Frantz Fanon's work, because he said, I'm not going with that trend. I, as a black man, could not be involved with an organization like APA that's involved in this torture. You just heard the record. You just heard the voices of the people who were involved saying that they were creating torture techniques for the CIA. I don't want to be involved in an organization like that. So at the end here, I'll tell you what organizations that are popular and proudly serving our communities. So when we talk about this COVID and the jabs that were provided and what happened, as we see, where are those players now today? So Plague of Corruption, Restoring Faith in Promise of Science. So this is by Judy Mikovits and Ken Heckenlively, and forwards by Robert Kennedy. So this book right here by the Children's Health Defense is really giving you a sense of some things that have been going on, covering up science, how we've been plagued with horrors. That's what I say, this is a psychological thriller that's going on. What you just heard from Robert J. Lifton, psychologists aided in the torture, and they should be charged. But where are these people? Why are they still alive? If you read this book, why is this person still around? Not really around. You don't even hear about why did they disappear? Where'd they go? Isn't that interesting? Of people who are great proponents of this experimentation, you don't see them in the media anymore. Psychological thriller. So I'm saying to you, you must read books. You must read texts. You must be able to decipher what's going on, because you're just going to be continually manipulated. So when we talk about the organizations, I would like to say there's organizations such as the Association of Black Psychologists. I definitely would recommend them as an organization to find some revolutionary scholarship and leadership and clinical work to help you get through some of your challenges. The Association of the APA, American Psychological Association, you see, they're involved and have been involved in some torturous campaigns. ABSI doesn't do that. 1968, they stepped away and said, let's create our own organization, and did that, and created the Association of Black Psychologists. So there are organizations that are supporting and helping and focused on freedom for formerly oppressed people. So all I'm saying is that you must find some way to research the right angles, because you'll get caught up in this psychological thriller. Will take you out. So thanks for coming back to the Learning Channel. Hopefully you learned something today about deciphering what's really going on in the real world so you don't get caught up in the system. Thank you for your time. And again, if there's some comments you have about some of the topics, hey, put them in the comment section and we will chat about it.